What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. And in today's video, I'm going to be building the ultimate small form factor gaming PC build for 2021 with Cooler Master's brand new colorway of their famous NR200p. That's right, this is a blue, a turquoise, a pastel PC build that performs incredibly well and looks just a little bit special. In this video, I'll be running you through all the components I chose and why, the build process step by step from start to finish, so you can follow along for yourself if you like before booting the machine up to see just how good it looks when it's all powered up, and then of course how well it performs in some of my favourite titles and some of your guys' favourite titles later on. Let's dive into it though after a quick ad from today's video sponsor. The latest range of Netgear Nighthawk routers are now available at Ebuyer, with support for the latest Wi-Fi 6 tech, which provides incredible network speeds alongside powerful processing and great signal strength. It's awesome for staying online with low latency all of the time. I've taken a look at the AX6, AX12 and XR1000 over on the Ebuyer YouTube channel and been super impressed. Strong signal strength and the legendary Duma OS on selected routers make them perfect for gamers out there. Learn more at the video in the cards section now, and the links to Ebuyer at the top of the description below. Usually at this early stage of the build, I'd kick things off by looking at the motherboard or the CPU or the memory, but today I'm not going to do that. I first want to take a look at the case, which is so incredibly unique and actually pretty exciting. Oh my goodness! This is insane! What on earth is going on right now? I will be the first to admit that this probably isn't going to be everyone's taste, but for me, I just love something a little bit different. The colour just looks really, really cool. It's like this retro pastel. You get these white accents as well, so basically no black in sight. Oh, shit. There was nearly no case in sight then, apart from a couple of black screws at the back and the black power adapter run through. You also get included a white side panel, which allows you to swap out the mesh panel for a glass one, which is something I'll definitely be doing today and will allow us to see our GPU choice, more on that later, front and center. I'm not sure whether that side panel actually makes the case look even more cool or even more of an acquired taste, but I guess we'll find that out a bit later. The NR200p from Cooler Master has actually been updated. So not only do you have great support for GPUs in terms of good GPU length, but you've also got a triple slot GPU if you have it horizontally, and a double slot with a good degree of clearance if you have it vertically. The interior layout of this case is slightly less space efficient than the NZXT H1 we recently looked at, but definitely more versatile as far as GPU and airflow and radiators are concerned. Speaking of which, you've got room for a 240mm radiator down here at the bottom, especially if you use the vertical GPU mount, which of course suspends that case much higher up and actually gives you that bottom space to play with. Requirements for your power supply are a little bit niche, as you would expect. You have to have an SFX unit, but we've got one of those, so we're all good to go. And you get plenty of room up top here for a couple of extra fans. As far as ITX cases for airflow are concerned, this is as good as it gets. You get a load of included accessories in this handy little NR200p accessory box. And these accessories include 2 fans with grills to stop cables getting trapped in and them spinning. And these are also colour matched in white. How cool is this? I mean, come on, Cooler Master killing the game with this. Not RGB, unfortunately, but I'm sure I'll get over it. And then if we just pop this off, you get all your case screws and accessories with plenty of cable ties. And of course, your GPU riser, which allows you to mount the graphics card vertically. As always though, with an ITX build, let's build up the motherboard, CPU, memory, and SSD now, and then we can look at the GPU and power supply in just a second's time. The motherboard I've picked up is the Asus ROG Strix B550i Gaming. This is an ITX motherboard that supports the latest Ryzen 5000 processors, Gen 4 NVMe SSDs with a couple of RAM DIMM slots, and a fairly decent rear I/O that does include 10GB USB-C, as well as 10GB USB-A, Ethernet, all that good stuff. This motherboard covers the bases really nicely. Of course, being an ITX board, you will pay more money for it and you will get slightly less features. but that's one of the trade-offs you get when building a super small system. I'll be coupling this up with an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X. This is an awesome chip for gaming, even with the most powerful graphics cards out there, and will work great for streaming, video editing, productivity, rendering, anything you want. This chip is the one for you. My intention with today's build is to go as all out as I can possibly get away with in such a small case with a lower rated power supply, which means this build is going to be a little bit of a cracker. I'll be coupling this up with some storage from Seagate, their FireCuda 520. It's a great Gen 4 NVMe drive with speeds in the region of about 5 gigabytes per second on read and write. It's got really strong endurance as well when you compare it to the competition, and while it's not quite as fast as Seagate's own new 530 or something like WD's Black SN850, it does come in at a lower price point. So that's pretty much okay by my standards. Finally then, the RAM I've gone for is a 16GB kit of Corsair's Vengeance RGB Pro SL. If you wanted to jump up to 32 gigs, you can do so, but you'll need to get 16 gig DIMMs as you've only got 2 slots on the motherboard. That's not because it's a rubbish motherboard, it's because it's ITX, and you simply haven't got enough space for more than 2 RAM DIMM slots as a general rule of thumb. Once we've gone ahead and done this then, and the motherboard assembly is looking pretty neat and tidy, we're going to go ahead and move this into the case. In order to do this, we're going to lay the case down flat. This is going to be much less of a challenge than with a massive bulky case you'll have seen us use previously. Make sure to line up the I/O shield with the rear I/O cutout before installing the motherboard, and then drop the board into place. You've only got 4 screws today, 1 on each corner, which once again keeps things simple, and it's literally impossible to cock up this step, so you'll be absolutely fine. Next up on the list today then is our CPU cooler. This right here is Cooler Master's ML240L. It's a 240mm cooler that will not only allow us to overclock our CPU if we wish, but will also help with general case airflow. When you've got a really small chassis like this, you need every single fan that you can get. And that means not relying on a radiator to solely cool the CPU, but instead to help cool the whole system. I'm thinking later that we'll have some intake fans at the top, so these are very likely going to be exhaust at the bottom. Installing the radiator onto the CPU is not too complicated in our instance. In fact, we're actually going to leverage the pre-installed plastic brackets on the motherboard itself to install that processor. Before we go ahead and do that though, I think we want to pop the radiator into the bottom of the case first. You'll see what I mean in a moment about this blocking any room for a GPU down here, meaning we will need to use the vertical GPU mount, which I personally think will look better anyway. Let's go ahead though and pop the radiator in. Just screw it down with the 4 screws through the bottom and then pop the fans on top. As you can see here, the CPU cooler actually installs pretty easily onto the CPU. Just drop on a dab of thermal paste, and then it's a simple case of slotting the metal D-shaped brackets around the plastic mounting hardware that comes included on the top and bottom of your CPU socket. Once we've done that, we can move on to the penultimate component and the final part before we install the graphics card, and that is of course the power supply. This is Cooler Master's V850 SFX. That means it's a super small unit, as you'll see in a moment when we go ahead and actually get it unboxed. In a small case like this one, the power supply is actually the easiest way that manufacturers like Cooler Master can make some big space savings. On your screen now is this power supply next to a full-size ATX unit that's also 850 watts. And honestly, the size difference is astonishing. This is still gold certified, so still gives you the great efficiency, and it just costs a little bit more money because everything has been shrunk down. Forget Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, it's Honey, I Shrunk the power supply. All in all though, the power supply is nice and compact, nice and cute, and fits into the little bracket that comes pre-installed in the case. You want to take the bracket out before installing the power supply, but it really is pretty easy. If you'd like to see a full cables and wiring guide, this video won't be one of those. You can find that as well linked in the card section now. Before finally moving on to the GPU, the graphics card and the main powerhouse section of today's gaming PC build. It is none other than this, the RTX 3080Ti. This is basically Nvidia's new flagship GPU when you forget about the 3090 for a second, which is not something I'd overly recommend from a gaming point of view. When it comes to 4K gaming, video editing, streaming, you name it, this card has got it locked down so well. High frame rate gaming at 1440p for the budding esports players, and 4K at 60, 100 FPS and beyond is more than capable on a card like this. I've been really impressed actually by the GPU clearance of this NR200P. Don't be too put off by how this kind of doesn't really match with the colour scheme today. I'm hoping a bit of RGB and the panels on will solve that problem for us. But it fits absolutely no problems at all. In fact, there's more room here, so if you had a thicker card, like a Supreme, that might work, although a card like that may be a tad long. I'll pop some specs on your screen now as far as how big a GPU can be to fit in this case. I think it doesn't hurt though to go smaller than what you could in a chassis like this. We're going to have plenty of airflow, especially with the final two fans, which will mount on the top shortly. And those fans at the bottom, GPU fans, temperatures for us should be nice and low. Plus, if you were concerned about temperatures and airflow, you could keep on the mesh panel rather than using the glass that I'm going to opt for today. Let's go ahead though and get this installed, and then once we've done that, boot the machine up to see just how well it performs in some of those titles we talked a bit about earlier. Before looking at performance though, there's one thing we do in every GeekaWhat video, and that's to see how good the system looks when it's all powered up in an epic glam montage. I'll see you in a sec, but roll that montage. As far as performance goes on this tiny turquoise powerhouse, we've been very impressed by the numbers that we've been able to achieve from this NR200p and 3080 Ti build. As usual, we're going to jump into a number of these titles individually in a second, so you guys can see the exact performance figures that we've been able to achieve. And let's do that by kicking things off with GTA 5. At 4K high settings, we managed to get 149 frames per second on average. Frankly, a phenomenal result for a build like this. Nearly 150 FPS at 4K, it looked great and it was tested in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode. It's no surprise to anyone that the 3080 Ti delivers phenomenal results. And that's a similar story in our next title today, Watch Dogs Legion. At 4K high settings with ray tracing enabled, DLSS enabled, we got 78 FPS on average, with some incredibly consistent results. Basically, our frame rate never really dropped below 70 frames, giving us roughly a differential between the average and 99th percentile of 8 FPS. That's a smidge over 10% and pretty extraordinary actually. Call of Duty's Black Ops Cold War was next up, and at 4K high settings with DLSS enabled, we managed to get some superb results once again. I think there's a little bit of a theme occurring here. Specifically 116 FPS on average, with 94 and 83 for the 90 and 99th percentile results. A couple of drop frames here and there in Cold War, hence that lower 99th percentile number, but that's more down to the game as it is the system. Apex Legends is next, and we tested this at 2 resolutions. 1440p first up, high settings, gave us 213 FPS, while tuning up to 4K high dropped us down to 140. So some great frame rate results at both resolutions, at both of course being much better as well than 1080p as far as visual fidelity goes, showing the power of this awesome pocket rocket teal turquoise beast. Next up is Valorant. At 4K high settings, we got over 300 frames a second. 305 FPS on average, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results in the region of 270 and 230. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, and here the results were once again pretty damn good. 95 FPS on average when testing at 4K high settings with DLSS enabled. No ray tracing enabled here. This would drop around about 35 FPS off your average from our testing, but I think Cyberpunk actually looks really good on a system like this, even without ray tracing on, especially when you can get near enough 100 frames a second. Moving on to Fortnite next up then, one of the most popular games. You guys love Fortnite, hence we feature it in every single video. 1080p low/competitive settings, where you tune everything down, set the render distance to far, yielded 315 FPS on average. 264 and 196 for the 90 and 99th percentile results mean your frame rate will never really drop below 196. And while this might look like a big differential, a big gap and quite inconsistent, you have to remember just how many frames 196 is, at least on the minimum end of the spectrum. Finally then, the last game today is a little bit of Call of Duty's Warzone. 4K, high settings with DLSS enabled, yielded 121 frames. Warzone has fallen out of popularity just a little bit as of late, but it's great to see you can still get some phenomenal results when it comes to Call of Duty Warzone on this system. With that though, that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Give us a big old like rating, get subscribed, you know you want to do it. Thanks for tuning in though, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.